Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. Israeli authorities say 6 people are dead, including a pregnant woman, after a shooting in Jerusalem. President Trump prepares to welcome EU leaders to Washington to discuss ending the war in Ukraine. And a potential economic and political crisis in France as Prime Minister Francois Bayrou faces a vote of no confidence from his own MPs. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has visited the scene of the Jerusalem shooting, where at least 6 people were killed earlier today. Dozens of people were seen running from a bus stop during Monday morning's rush hour. Paramedics say a further 15 people were injured, with 6 in a serious condition. Israeli police say 2 attackers were neutralized soon after. Here's what Netanyahu had to say.
We are now pursuing and surrounding the villages from which the terrorists came, and we will track down everyone who assisted them and those who sent them. We will take even harsher measures. I want to state as clearly as possible, these murders and attacks on all fronts do not weaken us. They only strengthen our determination to accomplish the mission we have set for ourselves in Gaza and Samaria and everywhere.
We can now go live to Jerusalem to speak to journalist Noga Tarnopolsky. Noga, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This has been called one of the deadliest attacks Jerusalem has seen in recent times. You do live in the neighborhood. Can you tell us a little bit about the victims who lost their lives and describe how people are feeling in the city right now?
Good evening, Leigh-Ann. Well, people are definitely feeling very rattled. It's interesting to hear the Prime Minister speak, as we just did on the screen, saying that this doesn't scare us, an event like this, it just heightens our determination. I don't think that reflects the feelings of general people in Israel. The bus that was attacked this morning is one of those buses that almost everyone uses. It crosses the city, and in fact, it passes around 100 meters from where I live here in this central Jerusalem neighborhood. The attack itself took place near the central bus station, so really a bustling area in the middle of rush hour. The people who were killed are very varied, from quite young, a 22-year-old Spanish citizen, actually, who had just moved to Israel, to a man of 80. It really is a cross-section. A 56-year-old woman born in Argentina is among the dead, and there are still people who are fighting for their lives in hospitals. So to sum up a day, I would just say very jittery. People feel afraid.
Yes, and as you just said to me, Noga, people feel rattled and afraid. The 2 attackers were shot by police. A 3rd has been arrested. What else, if anything, do we know about the people who are responsible for this?
So this appears to be what are called lone wolf attacks. In this case, not exactly lone wolf, because there were 2 perpetrators who acted together, 2 young men. Neither of them had any kind of terroristic background. Apparently 2 young men who on their own made a decision and had some help. I don't know if they had help getting they had a sort of improvised automatic weapon that's called a Carlo with them. What we do know is that they crossed over into Israel proper from the West Bank via a hole in the fence, and then they grabbed a taxi. The 3rd man you mentioned, the one who's been arrested, is that man who drove them to the site of the attack. And there's an interesting kind of public affairs angle to this tragedy, in that Jerusalem traffic has become almost impossible to navigate, and it's really a matter that has created a lot of anger against the government, and in particular the Minister of Transportation. And today, the fact that transportation in Jerusalem is so bad actually assisted the terrorists because they were able to basically keep shooting for long minutes at people who had nowhere to go because the traffic couldn't move. No one could move. And this also impeded the immediate arrival of security aid. So the question of actual traffic in Jerusalem has become quite an issue today. But what we know is just this: it's one of these attacks that's almost impossible to prevent because there's not a real organization behind it, at least not as far as we know right now.
And Noga, Hamas has praised the attackers but not claimed any responsibility. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz issued what he called a final warning to Hamas. He's told them to surrender or be annihilated. Will his words and the actions of the Israeli army be enough to release the remaining hostages inside of Gaza?
I doubt that very, very much. You know, the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, has become rather Trumpian in recent weeks, and he issues these last chance type messages every few days. Last warning, last this. It really does not seem to have much effect in the real world. Israel is pursuing its operation to besiege and occupy the city of Gaza, the largest city in Gaza today. Again, another one of these important towers, a skyscraper in Gaza, these skyscrapers that kind of really defined the line, the skyline of Gaza, are being toppled one by the Israeli army. And there appears to be a definite government decision to pursue that. Now, we don't know whether either of these young men have any links to Hamas or sympathies with Hamas. Islamic Jihad also issued the same kind of a statement. But I have to say that in recent times, that's become sort of a trend that terror groups, instead of claiming responsibility for this type of attack, they simply praise the attack. So it's hard to know. The Israeli government may decide to pursue, Hamas organizations in the West Bank as a result of this. But to be honest, the government has been doing that now for many, many months. So it's hard to imagine what they could do beyond what they have already done.
So today's attack follows a drone strike on Sunday by the Houthis at an Israeli airport that did injure 2 people. And Noga, you've just been speaking to me about the Israeli operation happening inside of Gaza City. Right now, inside of Israel, how are people responding to the government's actions? Is there support for Benjamin Netanyahu and the coalition? Are they supporting this operation inside of Gaza City? Because really now we've seen an attack by a Houthi drone, and now, as you said, a lone wolf shooting.
That's right. And today, there was an additional 3 missiles launched by the Houthis. They were intercepted. There were also some rockets launched from Gaza. The reality that you've just been describing for Israelis, with now this terror attack, with many of their children being called up to reserve duty, with deaths in Gaza for which they are being blamed every single day. This has become a very, very grim, grinding reality. And this is showing up in the polls. So Netanyahu, who has not been very popular throughout this term in office, right now really does not have the support of Israelis. A new poll came out just on Friday, a remarkable poll, because this time it was the Israel Democracy Institute decided to divide the respondents who had questioned by who they voted for in the last election, which took place in 2022. And so this poll showed not only what we already know, which is that about 80% of Israelis oppose the government's policies. They want this war to end. They want the hostages back, even at the cost of a complete withdrawal from Gaza, which is how the question was phrased. What's interesting about this poll is that it shows that even a majority of those Israelis who voted for the government in office now, for this coalition, they too want this war over. So Netanyahu is not just going against almost all of Israel's allies, but the United States, against the entire global community, against his own people. And notably, Netanyahu is acting contrary to the advice he received from his top security advisors, including the chief of staff of the army, who opposed this operation. But he's moving ahead for his own reasons. So there's an immense gap between how the government of Israel is acting and how the rest of Israel is feeling.
Noga Tarnopolsky in Jerusalem, thank you so much for your insights and for joining us this evening. Now, US President Donald Trump is preparing to welcome EU leaders to Washington this week to discuss plans to end the war in Ukraine. It comes as Moscow launched its largest overnight attack since the start of the full-scale invasion, using 810 drones and 13 missiles. A government building in Kyiv was struck, which the city's mayor says has crossed a red line. However, the Russian Ministry of Defense denied hitting the building. Here's what Trump told reporters following that blast.
European leaders are coming over to our country on Monday or Tuesday, and individually. And I think we're going to get that settled. But I am not happy with them. I'm not happy with anything having to do with that war. It's just such a waste of great humanity. When they're losing 5,000 to 7,000 soldiers a week for no reason, you have to get it settled. We're going to get it done. The Russia-Ukraine situation, we're going to get it done. I have confidence we're going to get it done.
We can now go live to Washington to speak to our correspondent there, Sarah Firth. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. So senior EU figures are in Washington, including the sanctions envoy, holding talks with US officials. What is driving this fresh push for action against Russia right now?
Yes, Leigh-Ann, the EU sanctions envoy, his team of technical experts, they are here in Washington, and they're going to be trying to hammer out some details to get some kind of measures when it comes to sanctions on the table agreed with the US that will really bite, that will push perhaps Russia and Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table. And really this has come about after we've seen this weekend the largest ever air attack on Ukraine by Russia, multiple cities targeted, those huge drone attacks that you mentioned. Among those killed, Leigh-Ann, a 3-month-old baby. So there's a real sense, both here in Washington and in Brussels, that this war has entered a dangerous new phase. Over the last year, we've seen Washington and Europe largely out of step when it comes to the issue of how to deal with Russia. We know that the US under President Trump has really prioritized pushing for peace and its own diplomatic efforts with Vladimir Putin. But with these latest attacks and with little development on that front, despite President Trump having met face-to-face with Vladimir Putin recently, we've now seen the president come out and say, yes, he is ready for the second phase of sanctions. He's also said, Leigh-Ann, he's going to be speaking to Vladimir Putin very soon, possibly in the coming days. But first, the EU sanctions envoy and his team, they're going to be looking to get on the same page here when it comes to sanctions with the US to try and give those sanctions maximum impact.
And Sarah, you just basically said to me, President Trump says he's now ready to move to a second phase of the sanctions against Russia. What remains unclear is what do we know about these sanctions and how might they actually look? And really, how significant of a shift could this be to tighten the screws on the economy in Russia?
Well, the president has been pretty evasive when it comes to exactly what these secondary measures look like. He was talking quite defensively, actually, about this first phase of sanctions that he imposed. That included 50% tariff on India. It was a secondary tariff on goods from India imported to America. Now, that came about because India is a major buyer of Russian energy. We don't know what the second package is going to look look like. What we do know, Leigh-Ann, is that the EU, they're drawing up their 19th sanctions package against Moscow. That is likely to include Chinese companies, Russian banks, vessels that are tied to this so-called shadow fleet that are able to evade sanctions for Russia. Whether the US will match that remains to be seen, but there have been some indications that that is the plan on the table, that the US wants to be honing in and targeting those countries that are still doing business with Russia. So anyone buying Russian energy above the G7 price cap, they would potentially be targeted with these secondary tariffs. Over the weekend, you had the US Treasury Secretary indicating that exactly that could happen, that these secondary tariffs could really impose this economic pressure on Russia by stopping the market, hopefully for that Russian energy, because then those countries that were buying wouldn't be able to import to America and possibly the EU without those sanctions hitting. All of this, as I said, Leigh-Ann, really aimed at bringing Vladimir Putin back to the negotiating table, putting that economic pressure on Moscow. But the Kremlin has come out and said there are no sanctions that will stop Moscow pursuing its stated aims. So a worrying signal from Moscow, but the EU envoy here today with his team will be looking with his US counterparts to really, as I said, get this transatlantic cooperation, get on the same page and try and come up with some kind of measures that bite. It's really going to depend, though, on the enforcement of this. And as we said, on the US and the EU really being on the same team when it comes to further action at this point.
Yeah, and that's the big question, isn't it, Sarah? Can they be on the same team? And this is what a lot of analysts are thinking. But as we're talking about this, you know, Ukraine has suffered one of the heaviest Russian barrages since the war began, killing civilians, and you said also killing a baby, hitting key government buildings. How much pressure does this now put on Washington to respond more forcefully? Because we've heard Donald Trump say many times, you know, we're going to sanction Russia, and it actually hasn't come to light.
Yes, and that recent meeting with Vladimir Putin, you know, we've heard Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky say Putin got what he wanted. He got that face-to-face meeting that he could show people, but he's not willing to meet with the Ukrainian president, and it hasn't brought about the necessary action from Moscow to stop the attacks. In fact, as we've seen over the weekend, those attacks have escalated quite significantly. A key government building among those buildings that were hit in that largest ever air assault. Those images, Leigh-Ann, the attacks over the weekend by Russia on Ukraine, they have been playing out on American TV. They've been playing out in congressional briefing rooms. What it's going to do is really strengthen the hand of a lot of people here in Washington who have been calling for tougher measures, who didn't necessarily agree that trying to pursue a path of diplomacy with Vladimir Putin was the right way to do it. There is a lot of criticism over that meeting that President Trump held with Vladimir Putin in Alaska, that it was simply playing in to Putin's hands. President Trump is facing the pressure domestically here at home from many within his own party, Republican Party, to stand up to the aggressor, to Russia, and really take firmer action. So we said the president has now signalled, he was asked very clearly, as we heard there by the reporter, are you ready to move to a second phase of sanctions? And he said, yes, I am. And he also said when speaking about those sanctions, look, I haven't even done my second phase, and he said possibly a third phase. So it does seem, given the latest action that Moscow has carried out against Ukraine, that the US president is on board now, is ready and signalling that he is going to be taking some further measures to try and put the economic strain on Russia. Leigh-Ann, we do know that sanctions haven't stopped Russia so far, the Kremlin coming out and saying the sanctions don't matter to them, essentially. So the US is going to be looking very closely now at what those next steps will be, and possibly today, possibly tomorrow, but certainly in the coming days, we expect to hear something about that meeting with the EU sanctions envoy and his team, and expecting a phone call and a talk between the US president and Vladimir Putin as well.
Sarah Firth in Washington, thank you so much for joining us. Let's continue this conversation with Jim Townsend, former Deputy Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO. Jim, thanks so much for joining us. A pleasure to have you on the show. So 3 weeks ago, President Trump held talks with Vladimir Putin. Since that summit, there's been no ceasefire or peace deal. Has Trump been played by Putin again, as President Emmanuel Macron has suggested, and Zelensky?
Well, it certainly looks like that's the case. This is a time now where Trump could be embarrassed. He could be looking at his own, how he's being portrayed in the media, his own reflection in the mirror, and understand that he's been played along. And this is going to be now to Putin. Putin could lose this relationship that he's been manipulating. He could lose that if he pushes Trump too far. So I think we've kind of come to the end of the road in terms of this little dance between the two. And we'll just see what happens now with Trump threatening that he's going to levy some of these secondary tariffs.
And European leaders issued a joint statement after the Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska. And of course, Jim, they rushed to Washington, changing their schedules. They're once again rushing to meet Donald Trump for crunch talks. Can they convince the White House to tighten the screws on Moscow's war machine? Or, as our reporter Sarah suggested, will we actually see Europe and the US working together in lockstep?
Well, we certainly have an opportunity. We've got a good chance because the European allies and the leaders have been saying to Trump for a while that he needed to put pressure on. And Trump wasn't ready to do that. He had his own methods, his own ways, his own instinct that told him what to do. And he's beginning to see now, as he has said, that this is tougher than he thought it was going to be, and that he didn't like anything that he's seen, and that he's starting to really understand that the pressure on Putin has got to be the next step. So he now has these allies who are finally saying, all right, well, let's do this together. We will have to, we're going to have a package of sanctions coming out of Europe. US, we hope you join us with more secondary sanctions yourself.
And the Kremlin has responded to President Donald Trump's threat, saying that no sanctions will ever be able to force Russia to change its position. As Russia grows closer to China and India, are these threats of any concern at all to Moscow? We've seen the ruble slightly weaken today on the back of more sanctions talk, but is a Russian economy robust enough?
Well, we'll find out. It'll be a bit of a race, I think, to see what crumbles first. The economy is held up by the energy sector in Russia. That's the money that comes in to fuel the war machine. It's their Achilles heel, if you will. And so that's why Trump and others have talked about that oil sector. He put the secondary tariff already on India for buying Russian oil. And you couple that with with the Zelensky attacking the oil installations where they make gasoline there in Russia. You have the EU also going after the shadow fleet of Russian tankers. So there's a lot of coordinated effort already going after that energy sector. And so we'll see what happens to the economy because of that. Certainly the money will have an impact in terms of money flowing back into Russia. If the Europeans can also stop buying Russian oil, I'm sure that is going to be part of the conversation between the European leaders and Trump, is the Europeans are going to have to step up and find alternatives to Russian oil.
And Jim, reports suggest the EU is discussing sanctions on China over Russian oil and gas. And we do know that China is a big buyer of Russian oil and gas, the biggest in the world. Do you think the US will back this proposal and also put sanctions on China like we've seen them do to India?
Well, it's a great question. It's going to be a roll of the dice for Trump because, you know, he has other ideas for the U.S.-Chinese relationship, particularly on the economic side. And if he joins in on secondary tariffs on China, that could upset those talks. So he's going to have to decide what gets his priority. Is it putting pressure on Putin on the one hand, or is it trying to go along with China and not get involved in a secondary tariff with China? I'm hoping it's going to be the secondary tariff on China. That's going to be maximum pressure on Putin, but we just don't know. We're going to have to see what the White House determines to do.
Jim Townsend, former Deputy Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO. Brilliant to have your insights. Thank you for joining us. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. A fugitive father hiding with his 3 children in a remote campsite in New Zealand has been shot dead in an armed confrontation with police on Monday. All 3 children have been taken into custody. Thomas Phillips and his children had been on the run for 4 years. At least 19 people are dead in Nepal after police fired tear gas and rubber bullets at thousands of young people attempting to break into parliament. The disruption began following a social media shutdown. The Nepali army was deployed after a curfew was imposed. 2 policemen were killed and 2 others injured after a shooting at a police station near the Turkish city of Izmir on Monday. A 16-year-old suspect has been arrested and an investigation opened. Local media are reporting that the teen wore a balaclava, a black top, and was seen carrying a rifle before the incident took place. And stargazers got the chance to see a total lunar eclipse, also known as a blood moon, on Sunday night and early Monday. It was the first time since 2002 that a total lunar eclipse was visible in the UK, while Asia, Europe and the Middle East had the best views. The next partial lunar eclipse is expected to take place in August 2026. Now, French Prime Minister Francois Bayrou's job is on the line today as MPs debate a vote of no confidence. If he loses, France could have its 5th Prime Minister in less than 2 years. With the country on the brink of an economic crisis and potential civil unrest predicted, French President Emmanuel Macron's political future is also in doubt. We can now go live to Paris to speak to our correspondent there, Ross Cullen. Ross, thanks so much for joining us. OK, France's 4th Prime Minister in 2 years is set to fall to a confidence vote in a matter of hours. So more turmoil looming in France and for President Macron.
Well, in fact, Leigh-Ann, it's a matter of minutes. We're just following now the fact that the voting has ended in the National Assembly, so the counting of votes is underway. If Prime Minister Francois Bayrou has got the confidence of his fellow parliamentarians or not, we suspect not. We do suspect the government to collapse and the Prime Minister to submit his resignation to the President tomorrow. Certainly, a lot of the turmoil is unfurling as we speak at the moment. There have been speeches this afternoon. We've had Marine Le Pen saying that a new election is not an option, it's an obligation. We've had the leader of Emmanuel Macron's party in Parliament saying that there needs to be some form of coalition of national interest. We have had the Green Party saying there must be a Prime Minister appointed from the left wing. We've had Marine Le Pen as well saying that this is an end to the agony of this phantom government. So we've had a lot of speeches in Parliament. You can see the National Assembly behind me here in the French capital. The voting has ended. The counting of those results is underway. So we potentially could bring you that result during this interview.
Yes, indeed, Ross. We are all watching for that breaking news in case it does come in. But so many of France's political problems come back to the economy. Prime Minister Francois Bayrou warning in his final speech that the country was facing a life-threatening crisis over debt. So, Ross, what has basically gone so wrong with France's finances?
Well, you're right, Leigh-Ann, to mention debt. The Prime Minister has said that the French people are addicted to over-indebtedness. He said this afternoon that since the year 2000, France has been falling in its productivity. There's been less and less productivity, less and less, fewer and fewer things are produced, are built in France. There needs to be a reversal of that situation. France also spends 25% of its budget on servicing its pensions bill. So that is one of the highest in the developed world. The size of the debt is huge as well. There have been systemic problems with the performance of the stock market here in France. So there are long-running issues that the Prime Minister believes needs to be sorted out. He believes there needs to be $50 billion worth of savings made in this budget, which is so controversial. And the opposition to this budget is nearly unanimous. That is why there are so many lawmakers against the budget, so many lawmakers against this government. So the systems with the economy really are the problems why there are political choices that have to be made for the future of France. According to Francois Bayrou, it's not just the future of his government, it's the future generations of France that might have to pay the price, he says, if tough economic decisions are not taken now.
So, Ross, as we wait for that news on the future of the Prime Minister of France, let's just talk a little bit about what will face Macron if this confidence vote goes away. We expect it to. He's now basically facing a task of finding another Prime Minister capable of steering a budget through Parliament, which is proving difficult, as you just said to me. So who are the runners and riders?
One of those runners and riders, in fact, just passed us 5 minutes ago, Leigh-Ann, the Defence Minister, Sébastien Lecornu. He's been put forward as potentially somebody who can bridge the left and right. The leader of the Socialist Party, Olivier Faure, he could potentially be a new Prime Minister if indeed Emmanuel Macron believes that there would be enough support for the budget if he appointed a Socialist Prime Minister. Looking to the biggest party in Parliament, that's the National Rally, the hard right. Their leader in Parliament is Marine Le Pen, but it could potentially be her protege, Jordan Bardella, who is the party president, just days away from his 30th birthday, so a very young leader, but potentially the new Prime Minister of France if Emmanuel Macron believes that he needs to appoint somebody from that side of Parliament in order to be able to get the votes from the far right on board for this budget. So a whole range of runners and riders, but this will be the 5th Prime Minister that Emmanuel Macron will be appointing in just his 2 years of his second term. He managed to get by with just 2 prime ministers in his first term in office. He will already have had 5 2 years into his term.
And you know, you mentioned it earlier. We saw Marine Le Pen speaking today, saying that an election needs to be called. It's now pretty much something that has to be done. Obviously, we know she is expected to say something like that. But Ross, you know, what is the probability of Macron calling another snap election? And right now, how popular is Emmanuel Macron in France?
Yeah, you're right. Marine Le Pen, in her speech, Leigh-Ann, did say that having another general election is not an option, it's an obligation. So she really wants to see an immediate snap general election. That does seem to be less likely. It's certainly something that Emmanuel Macron has the power to do. He exercised that power that is invested in the presidency of calling a snap election whenever you like. He did that in July 2024. You have to wait another 12 months, and we've now passed 12 months, so another election could be called as early as tomorrow. It does seem, though, that Emmanuel Macron wants to give the chance to Parliament to be able to put forward names for a Prime Minister who will be able to steer a budget through Parliament without having to face a general election. If there were to be a new legislative election. According to the most recent polls, the far-right party, the National Rally, would have the greatest number of seats in Parliament, but they might fall short of a majority. So we could be in a position, again, like we are in a position now, where it's a minority government, and if all the opposition club together, as they are doing this evening, then the government can't pass legislation. So in this period where we are now with a hung Parliament, it does seem that potentially a new election at the general level might not unlock that clarity that Emmanuel Macron said he wanted when he first called that snap election last year.
Ross Cullen in Paris, thank you so much. We are expecting that breaking news. Hasn't quite come yet. Once again, thanks. A judge in Australia has sentenced a woman to life imprisonment after murdering 3 of her husband's relatives and trying to murder a 4th with poisonous mushrooms. Erin Patterson was found guilty after a 2-month trial that ended in July. She won't be eligible for parole for more than 3 decades. Patrick Falk reports.
From a distance, Erin Patterson looked frail and needed to be helped off the police van as she arrived at court in Melbourne on Monday for sentencing.
For the attempted murder of Ian Wilkinson, I sentence you to 25 years imprisonment. For the murder of Heather Wilkinson, I sentence you to life imprisonment. For the murder of Gail Patterson, I sentence you to life imprisonment. For the murder of Don Patterson, I sentence you to life imprisonment. All sentences are to be served concurrently.
Patterson invited the parents as well as the uncle and aunt of her estranged husband to lunch in the town of Leongatha 2 years ago and served them beef Wellington laced with death-capped mushrooms. Her husband was invited as well, but declined. Within a week, 3 of the guests were dead. During trial, Patterson was repeatedly caught out lying and was found guilty of an elaborate cover-up. In sentencing her, Justice Christopher Beale said it involved substantial premeditation. Ian Wilkinson, uncle of Patterson's husband, was the sole survivor from the poisoned meal. Following sentencing, he thanked prosecutors and the police.
We're thankful that when things go wrong, there are good people and services and systems available to help us recover.
The case, dubbed the Leongatha mushroom murders, captivated the nation. There were mixed feelings among some people about the court's decision.
Look, I think it is fair because I think it's also about the message that it sends with that sort of crime. I understand that she's going to be looking to appeal, and I think that's fair as well.
I think she should have a chance after, 30 years. She's going to be, in her 80s. It's quite old. I don't think someone in their 80s should be in prison for something they did 30 years ago.
Patterson has been in custody since she was charged in November 2023. Her sentence is backdated until then. She has 28 days to appeal her conviction and the severity of her sentence. Patrick Falk, Al Arabiya English.
Let's take a look at the top business news now. Stocks rose and Treasury yields held lower after last week's dismal US labor data sealed the case for an interest rate cut this month. The S&P 500 is a touch higher, along with the tech-heavy Nasdaq, which is up 0.7%. The political uncertainty in France and Japan is keeping the dollar in check, while markets are fully pricing in a 25 basis point rate cut from the Fed. And turning to the sports news now, Carlos Alcaraz has claimed the US Open crown for a second time after his win over Jannik Sinner. The men's final was delayed by half an hour because of extra security measures put in place, and that was due to President Donald Trump's presence. Alcaraz has now won 6 Grand Slam titles, making him the second youngest man behind Bjorn Borg to reach that tally. And Tottenham Hotspur's board say their owner has rejected 2 buyout offers to purchase the North London club and repeated it is not for sale. The announcement came after the sudden departure of the club's executive chairman, Daniel Levy, triggered speculation that a takeover bid could now be imminent. A reminder of our top stories. Israeli authorities say 6 people are dead, including a pregnant woman, after a shooting in Jerusalem. President Trump prepares to welcome EU leaders to Washington to discuss ending the war in Ukraine. And a potential economic and political crisis in France as Prime Minister Francois Bayrou faces a vote of no confidence from his own MPs. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and, of course, follow us on X. The Rail deal with Tom Burgess-Watson will be coming up next. Plus, of course, we'll be back in a couple of hours' time with W News Extra. Goodbye and thank you.